So we want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend our Pros Who Know event today. This session is Sneak Peek 2021, an expert parcel shipping Q&A, brought to you by ProShip multi-carrier shipping software and featuring our partners at Invista, LPF Spend Management, and Summary Advisory Team. So we get started here, just a few quick housekeeping items. There are no dial-in numbers for this. You need to listen on the web session through your device's speakers. We are going to distribute a recording of this session after it's complete. So if you need to go back and listen to it again or anything you missed, you've got a chance to do that. All attendees are in listen-only mode for the duration of this session, but we do encourage you to ask questions to the panelists. This is a Q&A session, so you've got a chance using the question function there and GoToWebinar to submit questions. We'll attempt to address them throughout the discussion here, but we'll also reserve some time at the end to answer any questions that are left over. There's some handouts that accompany the session. This is made available from our speakers. Additional details, you're welcome to download those handouts through GoToWebinar so that you can have those and refer to those in the future. I want to introduce our speakers today. First off, myself, I'm Clint Boaz. I'm the Senior Sales Engineer for ProShip Software. Been in shipping technology, multi-carrier solutions for close to 2 decades, about 16 years at UPS. And today I'll be contributing to the discussion, also moderating and just moving things along. I want to allow our speakers to introduce themselves. Nate, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Clint. My name is Nate Skyver. I'm the founder of parcel consultancy LPF Spend Management. Prior to starting LPF, it's been almost 2 years ago, I spent over 17 years in retail, the majority of which was focused on parcel transportation and e-commerce with companies like Abercrombie & Fitch and Gap Inc.
All right, thank you. And if you have any interest in parcel at all, you need to be following Nate on LinkedIn. Put some great information out there about the parcel industry.
Thanks,
We're also joined today by a great partner of ProShip's, that's Invista. Mark, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Mark Taylor. I'm the Director of Parcel Consulting for Invista. My industry background is over 20 years with a start at FedEx Ground for 10 years in roles including hub industrial engineering, operations research, and new service development. I then spent some time as a shipper at Lowe's Home Improvement as their senior analyst for their parcel program. And now I've been with Invista for 8 years, helping clients to negotiate carrier agreements and analyze their spend with parcel analytics projects. So glad to be here and glad to join the other panelists.
Sure. And then last but not least, Josh.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Josh Mayer. I'm the founder and a managing partner at Summit Advisory Team. So we're a consulting firm largely geared around helping clients with omnichannel and supply chain operations, everything from strategy to sustainment. And excited to be here. Before Summit, I was similar to Mark and Nate, I was on the client side, so running supply chain operations at Kohl's department stores as well as Belk department stores. So happy to be here.
Yep, we're glad to have you and glad you're taking time to talk to our audience today. So you can see we've got quite a bit of experience, some bright minds in parcel here to address the topic of peak season. And that's what this discussion is all about, what to expect, how to plan for peak 2021. And I think we all know that a typical peak season is challenging enough, and with all the ongoing issues that we've had in the market with the pandemic, with the supply chain, it just means that we need to be even more diligent this year as we go into peak. So we're going to focus on that today. We're going to start off just looking at peak itself, looking at kind of a primer on what peak season shipping means and how to prepare for it. In a lot of ways, it's a peak season just like any other, but in other ways, it's going to be very different from other peak seasons. Probably very similar to the 2020 peak. We're dealing with a lot of the same conditions we dealt with last year. So we're going to look at some of the lessons we've learned from the 2020 peak and then project those forward into how we can apply those lessons learned into peak 2021, especially given current market conditions. And then we'll take a look even further ahead going into 2022 and how we can plan for that. And then, like I said, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Again, feel free to answer or ask any questions that you have throughout the session. And when we're talking about peak, we'll look at, again, peak season in and of itself. There are a lot of things to plan for, a lot of things to prepare for. And Nate, I know that you've had a lot of experience in managing peak seasons and previous roles. So if you could just start us off, kind of take us through a typical peak season, what activities that involves, and just give us some insights into the process.
Sure. So this is a really high level overview of what peak planning looks like, or at least probably looked like 2 years ago, the last time that I was on the retailer side preparing for peak, as many of our audiences. And from a high level, really peak planning to a degree, usually starts early in Q1. So it's hindsight of the prior peak, identifying what went well, what didn't, incorporating feedback and input from multiple cross-functional teams, operations, transportation, customer service, and really identifying then the opportunities or issues that need to be focused on in the current year for planning for the upcoming peak. And so that's really that project identification, prioritization. Sometime around the end of Q1 is getting that solidified. So then you've got about say a 6 to 7 month runway to get all that work done. Shortly after, depending on maybe the size of the retailer and the complexity of the business, is volume planning. And that is both internally, which again is with those cross-functional teams, but also with carriers. And I think it varies widely as to how early and how detailed the engagement is with carriers. I think the larger the retailer, the earlier and more detailed that process. But usually sometime in Q2 is pretty standard. At least it was 2 years ago. And then around the middle of the year, we're really looking at expense, and you've almost gotten halfway through the year and are looking at the back half from a forecasting standpoint and seeing how much the expense may be increasing, what the variance is compared to the budget, and then adjusting for those factors. And that volume planning and expense forecasting, those are just continuous. You start that process at various times, say Q2 into late Q2, and then it goes all the way through peak. And so that's a nice, clean, linear process, follows along. And then you've got the projects you started back in Q1. And hopefully those are completed exactly as planned, because it always happens that way, by say September. And then as that happens, you've got new capabilities in place, be it carriers, multi-carrier shipping solutions, other projects. Now you finalize your peak plan, and it's going to go perfectly. And you do it by October, and you're ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. As we know, everything goes perfectly whenever it follows this expected happy path, right?
Right. Yes.
But we know that we're dealing with some unusual conditions, especially since spring of last year. So let's take a look at some of the factors that impacted peak 2020. And again, I think we can all agree that we're dealing with a lot of those same factors when we're talking about peak 2021. So what are some of those factors and what are some of the lessons that we learned in dealing with them from last year's peak? One of the first ones, plan early. We saw a lot of companies that were planning their peak seasons earlier than usual. Certainly that applies this year. We even saw them doing things like accelerating their promotions earlier in the year so that they can, avoid getting behind, so they can spread demand across what capacity they had. So planning early is definitely something that I think we learned from 2020. The need to stay flexible. I think flexibility and agility are extremely important given some of the uncertainty that is ahead. And there's a lot of uncertainty last year. If you think back to this time last year, we didn't have a vaccine. Daily COVID numbers and new cases were increasing. We didn't know what the holidays were going to look like. We didn't know if there could be potential for, more lockdowns, if we were going to, be going through that same kind of completely restricted economic activity like we saw in spring of 2020, or if we're going to have a somewhat normal peak season. So it really emphasized the need to stay flexible, to have operating plans that could change, you could tweak as conditions on the ground evolved. Growth obviously was one of the big stories in e-commerce coming out of 2020. We know that the pandemic sharply skewed consumer buying patterns towards e-commerce, and it left a lot of retailers scrambling to fill orders. Limited carrier capacity. Obviously, we saw carriers restricting the capacity that they allocated to their customers, to shippers. Got very tight there in 2020, and we even saw a lot of carriers essentially firing their customers and saying, we're not going to carry your volume, probably because it was less profitable volume for them. But they were struggling under that increased demand. And then higher shipping costs. 2020 was the year that we were all reminded that shipping can be some crazy expensive stuff. It was the first year that all three major domestic US parcel carriers implemented a peak season surcharge. You had a surcharge from UPS, FedEx, and the Postal Service that impacted last year's peak. So everybody had to deal with that. It also reminded us that we really need to keep a close pulse on our operations through visibility, through analytics. We need to monitor volumes. We need to monitor costs and make adjustments where necessary. So these are some things that we saw that impacted peak 2020, and guess what? They're all very much factors going into peak 2021. So what we want to do here for the next little while is we want to focus on how some of these lessons learned can be applied into peak 2021, how peak 2021 may be a little different in some ways. And so to start off with, thinking back to Nate's presentation of what that nice linear happy path looks like for a well-managed peak season. Nate, what's that going to look like in 2021?
Well, it's probably going to look a little different. So this is essentially what I feel like in many cases it looked like in 2020. And I think as we're going to talk about details, throughout the last, say, 30 minutes or so, is many of these probably still apply. Maybe not to all situations, but seriously impacting the operations and peak planning for many retailers. And so I think what's relevant here is what we talked about, kind of the major themes or areas is plan early and stay flexible. This is a pretty good illustration of why you need to do that. And I think we saw last year where it just peak of 2020 seemingly didn't end, and it went straight into peak planning, which is hindsight immediately. And oh, by the way, you've got competing priorities that pop up, because now you've got much more than just parcel shipping to worry about coming out of peak. And so that immediately introduces complexity. You've got attention resources diverted all over the place. And so I think that's where this timeline, which now is kind of inundated with red and yellow and other very colorful things, that it's not linear. And so the timeline moves. There's more uncertainty, which requires flexibility. Peak surcharges. So this is why it's a 2020 view, because peak surcharges, like surprise, it's not peak yet, but they're there in June, and they're still there over a year later. Those are still things that shippers have to deal with. Capacity issues we'll talk in more detail about. And so those are things that are some more specific to parcel, but then some of the kind of questions or uncertainty, the thought bubbles, it's more broad. So from an e-commerce standpoint, does that demand shift back a little bit more to retail for those who have stores? Inventory is a problem. So all these things, I think, compound issues of standard peak planning, which isn't as linear as maybe I made it look like, and now it's just much more difficult. And so I think this is where we essentially are right now.
Yeah, Nate, looking at this page, it makes you mad, right? And that's probably how a lot of our attendees are feeling at the moment in terms of just uncertainty and the lack of control due to market conditions. Hey, one good question from the audience. So around volume planning, are you seeing the parcel carriers treat client shippers differently? So if a shipper's not e-commerce or not experiencing that growth, are they getting any relief from capacity or surcharges?
Mark, would you want to take a crack at that one first?
Sure. So if I understand the question, it's regarding other shippers that aren't necessarily e-commerce retailers and what they're doing, and are they still being affected? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. So UPS and FedEx's policies for peak surcharges do not discriminate between the commodities shipped, unfortunately. That said, there are some talking points there with people in different industries like pharma, like medical, that would definitely have a case that they have a more steady state commercial network that isn't impacting the pinch points that we see in e-commerce retail in residential shipping and delivery. So yes, pharma is affected. Do you have some room to speak with the carrier? Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just tack onto that as well that generally those other industries, healthcare, B2B, tend to be more profitable volume for the carriers as well. I know if you've been following some of UPS's announcements and some of the things that they're looking at doing, they're really specifically targeting healthcare and B2B because it is more profitable volume. Where we saw UPS refuse to pick up some of the volume, it was generally with retailers who are shipping very lightweight items, using last mile postal delivery services. So it's a very low margin business. But if you do have business that is higher margin, you may have a little bit more, leverage with the carriers, and that your volume is more desirable to them. All right, so we're going to continue here. So obviously the need to plan early is latent here in the 2021 season. Another thing that we mentioned is growth. Of course, e-commerce growth has been the story of the last decade or so. More and more of the economy is being moved on the backs of e-commerce as opposed to traditional in-person store sales. And the story of the pandemic has been that sharp shift towards e-commerce, multiple years of growth in just a few short months. And overall, with 2020, we ended up with a 34% increase in e-commerce sales in the US compared to the prior year. And all the indications are that that's continuing forward into 2021. We're still seeing high e-commerce demand. And Q1 2021, the economy added $215 billion, 7% increase quarter over quarter in e-commerce. And looking at this year compared to last year, Q1, up 39%. So we're still on an upward trajectory. And buying patterns again are being impacted by the situation out there. You're probably seeing a lot more consumers that are buying things in preparation for the post-COVID world, things like luggage, as they look to get back to some semblance of normalcy. But this projects likely even into future years. I think Mark, you've got some insight on this.
Yeah, just to drive the point home that Clint has made with the revenue numbers and e-commerce growth. Conceptually, what that looks like to the parcel carriers is that we've fast forwarded in growth almost 5 years. So if you look in past annual reports and you look at the ADVs reported, the average daily volume numbers reported for the national parcel carriers, the typical e-commerce growth is about 4% to 5% every year. So what we saw in 2020 is we had over 20% growth in package volume experienced in 1 year. So if you're looking at the graph, the green number, or the green line rather, is a conceptual version of that 4% growth. And the blue line is now what we've reset at because of the e-commerce growth of last year. So not to excuse carriers, of course, but part of the explanation of the capacity crunch is they're dealing with 5 years of growth in 1 year.
It's interesting, Mark. I'll add a couple of things too that almost a little bit back to Clint's initial information, more broadly speaking about e-commerce. I think it's interesting because there's, I'm obviously not an economist, but there are plenty who have pointed a bit to the moderation of the e-commerce growth, certainly year over year, now that we're into we're through Q2 rather. But I think what's interesting is there are a couple of things that I still feel are going to drive parcel volume at a higher trajectory than just e-commerce growth. One is the fact that we being, I guess, retailers and e-commerce companies, made it so easy to engage digitally and order and get things quickly. And so we're kind of feeding that convenience is feeding the volume, and it's just going to continue to grow. And part of that then also is from an omni-channel standpoint. Ship from store is not new. Obviously, it's been around for quite a long time, but many retailers last year who maybe didn't have ship from store in place implemented, or maybe they implemented this year. And for the most part, that inherently is somewhat of an inefficient process at first. And so there's going to be split shipments, broken inventory, and that's going to continue to drive up volume as well. And it's the volume that parcel carriers don't like. It's lightweight, it's from stores. So I think that just reinforces that the trajectory of parcel volume isn't going to maybe moderate as much as just the e-commerce demand.
Great points.
Yeah, so continuing in that vein, Nate, let's talk about the parcel carriers and the impact this is having on capacity.
Yeah, so I thought this would probably be an appropriate illustration here. It has to be what it feels like from a capacity standpoint, with just packages everywhere. But I mean, kidding aside, it has had a tremendous impact. The volume we just talked about on the parcel carriers, not just FedEx and UPS, but regional carriers. Their networks are constrained. Postal workshare carriers like Pitney Bowes and DHL DHL e-commerce, they're all taking on as much volume as they can or as they choose to in UPS and FedEx's case. And it's really driving a lot of things in the market, which we'll talk about a little bit more. It's shown up, of course, from a pricing standpoint, but then just operationally, both UPS and FedEx, this began last year and it's continued intermittently, and it's going to be, I think, a big challenge here during peak are volume caps. So that's one way that UPS and FedEx specifically have chosen to address the capacity challenge where demand just exceeds capacity. And there were a few times last peak season that it was public reports of very large retailers, sudden caps being issued. I don't know about those situations occurring again or how sensationalized some of those reports were, but caps haven't gone away. They're continuing to be there, and it's dynamic, of course, based on volume and origin and things like that. And so that, I think, has to be one of the largest concerns for pretty much any e-commerce shipper, retailer heading into peak. Some have already pivoted and made some adjustments, which is great, to the point this year, and added carriers, have diversified their carrier base. Others have chosen to kind of stay the course. So we'll see how it plays out, but I think the impacts we've seen thus far, and which began in 2020, have not moderated. So those really haven't slowed down much at all. So Mark, you're nodding your head a lot.
Well, I can absolutely. You've triggered me with your pictures. Just seeing piles of packages. I think that's every person's nightmare there. But definitely, Nate, as we've worked with different shippers this year, pretty much 2 years ago, the leading question into any analysis was, how much money can you save us? And how can you help us to optimize our carrier programs and really try to get as much out of the parcel carriers as we can? And we've definitely seen a sharp change in those questions to, how can I diversify this? How can I ensure that I get orders off of the dock? So there's been a very marked change in the types of questions and the types of help that our shippers need.
Great point.
All right, so let's continue talking a bit about the capacity crunch and what that means in terms of carrier relationships and the carriers themselves.
So unfortunately, one of the I guess the fallout from some of the capacity challenges, I say unfortunately, let me rephrase that. Unfortunately for customers of FedEx and UPS specifically, we'll talk about right now, is that has really resulted in both FedEx and UPS being in a position to dictate pricing to a degree that I don't know that we've seen. And what has happened is, and then this view really starts from when the peak surcharges domestically were first issued around the end of May last year, and through what's been announced, at least over on the right, of UPS announcing theirs, which actually extend all the way through the end of the calendar year into January 2022. And so what began as a peak surcharge to offset some of the increased operating costs for both carriers, which at the time was understandable, have now been the primary lever to really increase margin and drive revenue per piece. And to the tune of, on the margin side, of over $5 billion between the two carriers in their last three reported fiscal quarters. And so now, although there is the disclaimer on the peak surcharge page that states we have very high demand for our services, Therefore, there are peak surcharges. Peak surcharge, I think, is a bit of a misnomer because it's certainly not peak season or not what retailers have often considered peak season, but there are additional costs nonetheless, and it does not appear to be ending anytime soon.
Okay, and then Mark, I believe you got some insights in terms of what that means for carrier negotiation.
Yeah, so there's a good index, the DHL Supply Chain Pricing Power Index, that we've been tracking. It's published on FreightWave's website. Anyone can look at this each week and see where this is going. But essentially, I wanted to use this index to just underscore how negotiation is going and what type of a market we have. So if you look at the graph, the bottom of the graph, anything that is less than a 50 on this index is good for shippers. That's a shipper leveraged market where the carriers have more capacity than the demand would come up to. And anything in the red or above 50 is a carrier leveraged market. So if you look at the bottom of the graph and the time series, you can kind of see where in the period of last summer, we went very sharply from a shipper leveraged market to a carrier leveraged market, and we have stayed that way for quite some time. Now, the light at the end of the tunnel is if you look at the end of that graph and some of the July numbers, there is a general trend that maybe this is starting to come down a bit. We're hoping that as more capacity comes online in the coming couple of years, as well as some of the market conditions start to regulate, retail starts back more into the brick and mortar, we may see some better conditions here. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides.
Right, so all this raises questions, right? We're talking about peak 2021. Probably a lot of questions in the minds of the audience in terms of what can I do about it? What can I do about it now? What is there time left to do? So Josh, I'll hand this back over to you. What can shippers do now to plan for the pending peak season?
Yeah, I think I'm assuming most of our attendees are in that seat, right? So regardless of how well you've planned to this point, there's only a few months left before the traditional holidays are upcoming. And I will piggyback quickly on the capacity constraints. I got a text message the other day from a COO who said he's standing on a shipping dock because FedEx won't pick up his packages, and he's trying to decide what packages won't make the trailer. So, if you're in that seat, you're not alone. It's a very challenging environment right now, and that's really the theme we see going in over the next few months. Is talking with clients a lot about governance, about planning for the worst and hoping for the best, and testing those strategies between now and the holidays. So if you've just introduced a new carrier, practicing turning them on, simulating the pickups, and actually getting packages to customers end to end, along with that communication. So planning for the worst, hoping for the best, aligning internally on the levers you can pull and you're willing to pull to mitigate risk when it comes to customers. The other topic is just a lot around visibility and analytics. So in order to make these decisions, you need to have the right set of data. And for the attendees and shippers out there, it's all, for the holidays, it's all around cost, quality, and speed from order placement to customer delivery. So it sounds easy. It's much more challenging getting all of that data into one spot and making sure you have the right metrics that your team would need to run the business and ultimately pull the levers that if a carrier doesn't show up one day, what you do in those scenarios. So try to mitigate risk, by having the right analytics so you can make decisions in more real time is something we're talking a lot about with clients. And then last but not least, just reacting. I mean, I know we're talking a lot about parcel. There's a lot of challenges around staffing. We're working with clients on making sure they can staff to the volumes they've committed to with carriers. So keeping a pulse on that as well to make sure that you're communicating daily with the carriers going into the holidays. But those are really the key points. I guess, Clint, question for you, and as ProShip, you guys support some holiday readiness with clients. What are some of the things you're seeing, you're getting asked for, on a daily basis in terms of holiday readiness?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think all these challenges we're talking about, capacity issues, pricing pressures, definitely carrier diversification is where it's at and going for a solution. I'd say the number one request that we've had over the last 12 months, and one of the top reasons why we have more and more shippers adopt ProShip, is to onboard new carriers. We're constantly getting asked to add and enable new carriers for our customers. But as we've kind of alluded to here for 2021, it's getting pretty late in the game to start negotiating new agreements and new relationships with carriers. Like adding new ingredients to the recipe is not as viable now, but you can still change the mix of those ingredients in the recipe and still have a good result. So we're working with our clients now to really optimize the business logic for carrier selection, which is a concept you might have heard us talk about called carrier volume balancing. And it's really to make sure that you're hitting that sweet spot mix of carrier services so that you can maintain the maximum or the minimum volume that you need in order to keep your discounts with the carriers, but also stay within the capacity constraints that they're feeding you, sometimes on a daily basis. And really, it's about using the optimal mix of carrier services for the various zones and lanes and weights and service levels that is going to end up being the most efficient combination. And again, automating that so that it can be enacted very efficiently in operations. So we're working with a lot of our clients right now to do that and to set up those business rules to balance the carrier volume optimally.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I could add a couple things to that too, or actually add and pose a couple questions. Just on a couple things you just finished with, Clint, around adding carriers. That's been a focal point for your customers and having engaged in doing that. How have you seen, and maybe Josh, you as well with some clients, but how have you seen the timeline or maybe the cutoff to do that for this peak season and maybe even last? How has that changed or not changed as far as the timeline on the calendar to get those changes in?
Well, I'll put a couple of considerations out there. First off, generally speaking, in any peak season, we see any system changes really being nixed after about October. Typically about September, October, our customers will go into a code freeze and they'll lock down any system changes. And we talk a lot, when we've talked on different webinars in the past about how peak season from a systems perspective should be managed as a software development lifecycle that really begins in January and takes you through your code changes and your quality assurance and your testing, and it goes all the way up into September, October, after which point it's really unlikely that you're going to want to take the risk to bring on additional changes. So traditionally, that's what we've seen. I would say that's obviously or very apparently moved up on the timeline. We're working now. Here we are in the middle of the summer, hashing out what those business rules should look like, getting them implemented. So it's definitely moved up at least by a couple of months. But again, we've made this point. We're calling this peak season and thinking about it still as if peak season is like November and December. But I think Mark made the comment the other day that we've basically been in a continuous peak season since spring of 2020. And so, we've been working with clients continuously to implement new carriers, implement new business logic. But I think as it relates to getting things in before this peak holiday shipping season, we're definitely doing that right now. And the smarter shippers are already taking advantage of that capability.
Yeah, I would echo that. Two other comments. As you guys know, contractually it's much earlier. So if you didn't have agreements in place in the spring, you're probably not implementing a new carrier or even a service at this point. And then just to piggyback off Clint's comments, I think anything around changing carrier, changing service, we're seeing that implemented in a much more, I guess, configuration-based way, so that you don't have to have code changes during peak. So there's that flexibility we touched on. Everything should be configurable. That's on the slide here. The test and learn we're talking about is all around that. So pushing the buttons and making sure that, today I ship with a big national carrier, tomorrow I ship with a regional, that process works and is ready to go. And Mark, before we leave here, I think one of the big questions we talked about earlier in the week was, as a shipper, do I have any leverage left with carriers when it comes to capacity or pricing? Are you seeing any way for shippers to have some relief this holiday?
Well, with what I shared previously, this is a very tight market to try to negotiate any sort of profitable terms for the shippers. All of the profit, all of the margin right now is going to the carriers. With that said, there are some shippers that can make some headway during this time, and those would be more on the small to medium side. If you have a carrier program in which you spend more than approximately $50 million per year, then this is not the market for you to go out to RFP in. Not right now. But if you are a small or medium-sized business, those are the shippers that the carriers are still talking to. And by all means, if your carrier agreement is soon to expire, or if there are any particularly rough terms that you're having a difficult time with, you always can speak to the carriers. But from a negotiation standpoint, this is a very difficult market to do that in.
Yeah. So along those lines,
it hurts to say that, doesn't it, Mark? I mean,
it really does, because
I've had to say it a lot recently too, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but completely agree. And there are certain opportunities that makes sense, to your point, based on the amount of volume, perhaps even the volume profile that might be a little bit more attractive and even high margin. It's kind of funny to think of it that way as a shipper, knowing that your volume is higher margin, but I do think there's still opportunity there as well. But it's limited both by the amount of opportunity, but also the timeline. So completely agree. But just had to kind of express my discomfort with that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, as someone who has helped shippers with that for 8 years now, it's very difficult for me to say. So
agreed.
Yeah. And Clint, if you advance, this is a good segue into Nate. Maybe as a shipper, if I'm looking to add carriers last minute here, what are my options?
Yeah, so there are still some options. If anybody does happen to follow me on LinkedIn, this might look familiar. So this is something that I put together recently, but it was really to create awareness of the fact that despite being in the 11th hour for peak season, there are still some opportunities in the right situations to add carriers to your carrier base. And so, I shared some of this, and just taking a look at it, there's some of them with the captions that have already either kind of closed for the season. So LaserShip is a good example, And I kind of appreciate the way that they approached it. So they announced in June they weren't going to onboard any new customers for the rest of calendar 21, but kind of took the approach of reserve your space for 2022. And I think it's a good approach. And so that's what they're doing. And Josh Deneen mentioned that yesterday on the death of a single carrier webinar. So I think it's a fair approach. They obviously had a decision to make about kind of closing the network, so to speak, and others will be doing so shortly. So on track, there's no date, but it's coming pretty soon, I think. T-Force is another carrier that maybe not as well known, but they're a regional carrier with, I think, over 50 locations, kind of more final mile type locations, September 1st. And then LSO, they're expanding into different coverage areas ahead of peak, but October 4th, Dick Metzler was also on the same session yesterday. He said, as of that date, after that date rather, that's it. But other carriers like a Pitney Bowes and DHL Ecommerce, I would expect at some point that they will do the same. They've obviously got, I guess, more capacity, or at least spread across, greater origin points and facilities, but it will be coming. But my, recommendation would be, obviously, if the shipper hasn't started that process, I would start about 4 o'clock today, at least Eastern, and be really intentional about it. Know what volume segments, coverage areas, origins that you need capacity or whatever the need is, and reach out directly to those carriers that can help you or you think they can, and get it done quickly. Because I don't think running past August at this point, which we're almost into August, is really a good idea. So
Right.
so that's kind of the long and short of, can I do anything now on the carrier diversification?
So some notable omissions from this slide are FedEx, UPS. What about USPS?
USPS. So they aren't on here intentionally. So I think a lot of the audience probably is aware of the pretty public issues from a service and network standpoint that USPS had last peak. Not entirely, I would say, I guess, their fault. They basically, in the way that they accept mail, they also accepted packages, and they just served as the release valve for a lot of retailers and e-commerce shippers who, because of everything we've talked about, didn't have the capacity with other carriers. And although the USPS has outlined a plan for some capacity in the short term here for this peak, it's kind of, I want to say, behind closed doors. They've said this is what our goal is, to improve our capacity, not quantifying it, and improve service reliability, but we'll wait and see. And so I think they're an option. Maybe proceed cautiously based on last peak, but they weren't listed on here kind of for that reason, because one way or another, I guess, I don't want to call them a last resort, that's not fair, but not in the same kind of manner as seeking out these carriers, I think, specifically.
Got it.
Well, and in some way, they are kind of on here in that they are the last mile for DHL Ecommerce, Pitney Bowes, and some of the other services. So the Postal Service definitely is somewhere that's still active and did help a lot of shippers last year. Unfortunately, they were inundated in doing so. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I know we're about 10 minutes left here. So Mark, I think that's a good segue into some of the notable initiatives around increasing capacity. Not sure if you just want to touch on some of that.
Sure. And so after the smoke clears from this peak, one of the recommendations I know of this panel would be to really start working on the next one. And when we look at what the national carriers have expressed, what the regional carriers have said that their expansion plans are, we hoped to encapsulate some of those plans in the next couple of slides. So UPS and FedEx, UPS has definitely pulled no punches in that they are squarely focused on margin and building a better, not bigger network for UPS. They will continue expansion plans. They always do year over year, but that's been the tagline several times for Carol Tomei on the quarterly calls. FedEx is adding ground facilities. It does have 100 expansion projects in the works. For the first time in a presentation like this, I'm actually adding Amazon as a parcel carrier. It's a little dicey for me to do so, but I think it's appropriate. So Amazon is aggressively pursuing increased capacity for their network. In fact, invested 50% or 50% increase in their capacity in 2020, and has decided to continue to expand that and increased 80% this year in a category that includes their logistics services and AWS. So more on Amazon to come in 2022. I think that might be the shakeup that the market needs if they do broadly offer their services. The Postal Service, Nate touched on it. There is a Delivering for America plan that the USPS announced this past spring. It is a 10-year, $40 billion expansion plan, investing into their infrastructure, improving service, and we would love to see it. So bring it on, USPS. We would love to see that alternative. DHL is broadening its presence in the United States again. Some of us are old enough to remember when DHL was a thing and effectively a third carrier. And they are reinvesting in the Americas division, $360 million by next year. So that includes a new Miami hub, a new Ontario hub in Canada, and new planes to their fleet. So DHL e-commerce definitely is a carrier that folks could consider. And then lastly, on the regionals have also expressed some expansion. Lasership, we mentioned before in the presentation, they expanded into an entirely new state. They've increased their coverage by 18%, and they are definitely active for 2022 and are talking to shippers about starting new agreements then. OnTrack expanded in February 2020. They opened a new Reno hub and added capacity. And Lone Star Overnight plans for a 5-state expansion into Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Kansas. So the regionals are definitely a place where people are going to diversify and get around the capacity constraints that we saw. But those are just a few pieces of the puzzle as we expand capacity, and tried to speak quickly through that, but of course would entertain questions about that as well.
All right, and last thing here, just in general, Josh, what do you recommend in terms of looking ahead to 2022? And then again, if our audience has any questions, again, feel free to post those, and we'll try to get all those wrapped up here in the next few minutes.
Yeah, I think I would, just drive home a lot of the points we touched on today. So flexibility is key. There's still going to be a lot of uncertainty in terms of volume and forecasting going into holiday 22. So, implementing flexibility these days, the reality is that's through technology like ProShip and others, where you can leverage the capacity that Mark just shared. So getting ahead of that and trying to start those conversations now, and contractually securing capacity and pricing. And then the visibility we touched on. So like I touched on earlier, a lot of our clients do not have the right analytics and visibility they need to manage the day-to-day. So just making sure that that is in line as you add carrier diversification and add these new services, make sure you have the right visibility to properly leverage those.
Yeah, I would just a couple of things to add real quick is I think that a lot of what we've talked about around capacity, and so that there's a lot of, I would say, issues or challenges stemming from that, is that according to UPS and FedEx, they've both stated publicly in their earnings calls that they expect at least the demand for their services to exceed capacity enough for them to continue in some form their current pricing actions for anywhere from 12 to 24 months. I think they're probably in their best interest to say that in confidence to make sure that investors and analysts hear it, but I don't think that they would put themselves out there to say it if it weren't true or they didn't believe it. So from a pricing standpoint and capacity, maybe it does moderate a bit, but looking ahead, I still feel like there's going to be challenges in some way on both of those fronts.
I think that there will be too, and I wanted to address one of the questions that has come up in the chat. So there was a question about a benchmarking index that possibly one of us could point to. So my short answer on that is that not really. There isn't really a benchmarking index that would be reliable for you individually as a shipper. And one of the things that makes that challenging is the confidential nature of parcel pricing. However, when we help with parcel analytics projects, often we will look at what we know about the industry and help individualized clients with the parameters in their program to come up with valid benchmarks.
Hey, so if anybody has a last minute question, we do have about 1 minute left. Feel free to post that. Any parting thoughts here, Nate, Mark, Josh, before we close out the webinar?
I just wanted to thank our audience and the other panelists. I appreciate your time and appreciate all of our industry professionals. I think this is a time to lean on each other and find good solutions.
I agree as well. Appreciate working with all the panelists and certainly everybody who attended. I think this topic is obviously relevant not only for peak season, but almost on an ongoing basis. So I'm sure in some form, one or all of us will be involved, certainly out in the market and having discussions with be it clients or contacts, but even a forum like this, peak hindsight. We'll take a look at it at some point.
We did get a quick question that I think that Nate and Josh could help out a lot with. Are you seeing more ship from store and any new trends on omni-channel fulfillment to help with DC capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for omnichannel, I'd say for omnichannel shippers, there is a lot of conversation around volume planning by channel and finding ways to even mitigate some of the risks we talked about today through pushing the marketing for pickup in store, pushing the marketing for things that is going to avoid some of these conversations altogether. So absolutely, we're seeing. Nate had touched on it earlier. There's a lot more omni-channel capabilities out there, given where the inventory is, and so just finding ways to make sure that there's a good visual, but you've got volume planning for that, and you're trying to drive traffic to what's most profitable for you.
Yeah, I think to add to that on the ship from store standpoint. So one example, and I can't share the retailer, but it's still relevant, is that a pretty well-known retailer who is building e-commerce as a larger part of their retail business coming into this year, ship from store ended up being one of the largest, if not the largest, omnichannel initiative that they implemented because they didn't have it before, and a lot of resources were devoted to it. And kind of going back to that very curvy line of competing priorities and other things on the timeline for peak planning, that's essentially what happened in this case. Was ship from store being such a large initiative, impacting revenue and other things, took priority over diversifying their carrier base. And so that's kind of the position I think many retailers are in who don't have those omnichannel capabilities. And then really it ends up being, we'll say a no-brainer, but pretty much to implement those if you have to choose between that and just adding carriers. So I absolutely think it's becoming more relevant, and that should only continue. I think also as retailers become a bit more sophisticated with how they deploy their inventory.
Yeah, and no, those are great call-outs, Nate. And I think you touched on some of the regional carriers that are even still available for this holiday, but that's becoming more relevant. And I think that's how we're seeing ship from store too. Is just if I can get the inventory closer to the customer, I can leverage some of those options that are more regional and take advantage of that capacity. So it's really good points.
All right, well, I think we're going to call it there. We've gone over a couple of minutes here, so those of you that stayed on, we definitely appreciate your time and attention. Again, on behalf of ProShip, I want to extend our appreciation to Nate, Mark, and Josh for taking the time, investing the time in this discussion. And again, avail yourself of the handouts, the additional information that's available, and we will post this recording if you want to go back and listen to it again, watch it again. Other than that, we thank you for attending, and contact information here is on the screen. Feel free to contact any of the panelists here for additional information, additional follow-up conversation. I'm sure that we'd be glad to have that with you.